The snow began falling in earnest the day they crossed into the Bitterroot Range, thick as wool and silent as prayer. It muffled the sound of hooves, the groan of wooden axles, the rasp of breath. Trees bowed under the weight of it, boughs stooped like old shoulders. To Mercy Quinn, it felt like stepping into a dream too white to be real, or maybe a dream she had once tried to forget. They had no business being out there, not in December, not with the sun a faint coin behind pewter clouds. But the wagon train had splintered after the sickness, and when Mercy's sister died in Idaho City, the last of her blood kin went with her. There were no goodbyes worth saying, just a shallow grave near the banks of the Piet, and a man named Elias Cutter who stood beside it with his hat pressed to his chest and grief in his jaw. He wasn't kin, wasn't even kind, not in the way most would call it. But he was there, and he had a team of mules still strong, and a plan to head east before the last passes closed. Said there was work in Montana, trapping or timber or whatever else a body could swing a tool at. Mercy hadn't asked for details. She only knew that staying meant another winter in a mining camp that had already taken too much from her. So she went, and so did he. They traveled together in silence at first, though not out of spite. Words didn't come easy when every mile was a reckoning. He had a quiet way about him, Elias, watchful, solemn, slow to move unless something needed doing. He didn't speak unless it mattered, and when he did, his voice was rough as bark and low as river stones. Mercy noticed things, how he let the fire die low at night to save wood, even if it left them cold. How he never looked her directly in the eye, but always seemed to know when her hands needed warming. They shared hard bread, bitter coffee, and the kind of understanding born not of affection but necessity. They didn't speak of the cold or the loneliness. They didn't speak of the others they'd lost. On the fourth day, one of the mules came up lame. Elias crouched beside it, hands steady on the haunch, studying the leg with narrowed eyes. "We won't make the pass at this pace," he said. Mercy didn't answer. She already knew. The storm came that night, wind carving through the trees like a blade. They found shelter under a lean-to of fallen logs, made a fire that smoked more than it burned. Mercy's fingers went numb before the heat took hold. Elias pulled a blanket around her shoulders, rough wool, full of the scent of cedar and smoke. "You'll freeze if you sleep alone," he said, his voice not unkind, just factual. She looked at him then, his face lined and wind-chapped, eyes the color of creek ice. There was nothing romantic in the proposal, nothing soft, just two people against the wilderness, backs to the dark. "You offering your coat or your name?" she asked. His eyes flicked to hers, then away. "Both, if you'll take them." It wasn't a wedding in the way some folks imagined. No preacher, no rings. Just a muttered vow between two souls wrapped in smoke and snow, the pine trees towering above like witnesses older than time. They married beneath snow-laden pines just to survive. Mercy pressed her hand to his as the wind howled around them, fingers curling into the spaces between his knuckles. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. They shared one blanket that night, two bodies huddled close, not for want but for warmth. The storm passed before dawn, but the cold lingered. In the days that followed, something began to shift. Not quickly, not like fire, but like a seed cracking beneath the frost, slow and unseen. They spoke more, small things, where he came from, a sister in Arkansas, a dog he'd once lost in a flood. She told him about her father's fiddle, the sound of it on summer nights back in Missouri, about the way her mother's hands always smelled of lavender water and flour. They never touched more than they had to, but she noticed how he moved closer when she sat at the fire, how he began to pack extra jerky in her saddlebag, how he gave her the last swig of coffee without a word. The pass loomed ahead, and with it, the question neither of them had spoken aloud. What happens when the snow thaws? Mercy wasn't sure. She didn't know if love could grow in frozen ground, or if what they had was only a thing built of hunger and need. But she knew the way he looked at her now, when he thought she wasn't watching. As if she were more than a burden to bear, as if she were the last warm thing in the world. And beneath the cold, a root took hold. They rode on. The road east was a narrowing thread, winding through valleys thick with snowdrifts and silence. Winter pressed in close, a white shroud that muffled the sound of hooves and breath alike. The pines stood like sentinels, tall and unmoving, their limbs heavy with the weight of the storm. And still Elias rode ahead, steady as ever, the line of his back etched against the cold horizon. Mercy followed, her mare plodding through the snow, nostrils steaming. The cold had gotten into her bones, and she wondered if it would ever leave. But there was something else now, something quieter and harder to name, an ache that came not just from hunger or frostbite, but from the shape of Elias' shoulders when he turned to make sure she was still behind him. They found a hunter's cabin 2 days later, empty but standing, its roof sagging under the snow. The door groaned on its hinges but held, and the hearth was dry enough to take a flame. Elias cut wood without speaking. Mercy swept out pine needles and mouse droppings, wrapped her hands around a cracked tin mug of broth, and watched the light return to the room inch by inch. That night he made her sleep in the cot. "You're smaller," was all he said, laying out his bedroll near the fire. Mercy didn't argue, but long after he lay down, she listened to the rhythm of his breathing, slow and even. The way it steadied her own surprised her. The days passed slow. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, they fell into a rhythm. He mended the tack. She boiled beans, cleaned the rifle, patched worn socks. They spoke more in half-sentences and knowing glances. No declarations, no sudden affection, just a slow unfolding. She learned the sound of his quiet laughter, rare, low, like a log splitting in the fire. He learned that she hummed under her breath when she cooked, tunes with no names. She told him once, over dry cornbread and salt pork, about the boy she'd almost married back in Independence, how he'd gone off to fight and never come back. Elias only nodded, but the next day he chopped twice as much wood and didn't make her carry a single log. He never reached for her, never touched her unless necessary. But when her fingers split from cold, he rubbed salve into the cracks without a word. When she wept one morning, quiet and trembling, for no reason she could explain, he handed her his coat and sat beside her until the shaking stopped. Once she caught him watching her as she poured water from the kettle, not with hunger, not with pity, but with a kind of stillness she recognized, because it lived in her too. Grief made quiet companions of them both. Mid-January brought wolves. They didn't see them at first, just found tracks near the shed, the mules restless, eyes wide. Elias kept the rifle by the door, slept lighter. Mercy saw the way his hand hovered near the trigger when he opened the door at dawn. Then one night came the howl, long and low, not far from the tree line. Elias stood in the doorway with the firelight at his back. "They're hungry." "So are we," she said, but her voice was low, the joke brittle. They kept watch in shifts that night, one by the fire, one by the door. Mercy wrapped herself in every blanket she could find and kept her fingers near the flint. Elias sat beside her come morning, his beard frosted with cold, his eyes ringed with shadow. "You ever shoot one?" she asked. He nodded, "Ate it too." Mercy's mouth twitched, tough. "Unkind." She laughed, more breath than sound, but it stayed with them all day. 2 mornings later, a wolf came close. Not alone, 2 others flanked it, silent as snowfall. Elias stepped out into the snow with his rifle raised. Mercy watched from the window, heart hammering, breath fogging the glass. One shot rang out, sharp as a shout. Then the quiet returned, deeper than before. He came back with blood on his sleeve and a fresh tear in his coat. She stitched it that night, small even stitches, while he read from an old dime novel he'd found in a cupboard. He didn't ask her to sew it. She didn't ask him to read. That's how it was between them. They didn't name what was growing between the floorboards and firelight, but it grew all the same. Outside, the cold deepened. Inside, something softened. One night in the dark hush of early February, Elias said her name. Just her name, like a prayer. She turned to him, the light from the hearth warming the side of his face, and in his eyes there was something open, something raw. "I think of you when I chop wood," he said. It made no sense, and yet it made all the sense in the world. Mercy laid her hand on his calloused palm to calloused palm. She didn't ask what he meant, she only held on. By mid-February, the wind changed. Subtle at first, a shift in the way it moved through the trees, less like a blade, more like a breath. Icicles began to drip. The morning stayed bitter, but by midday, a sheen of melt clung to the eaves. Spring was still a rumor, distant and quiet, but something in the woods had stirred. Mercy felt it in her spine, that thrum of coming change. She watched the way Elias scanned the ridges, more often now, eyes narrowed beneath his hat. His silences stretched longer, less settled, as though he were already somewhere else. Something about it unsettled her, not like fear, but like the knowledge of a good fire nearing its end. They never spoke of what they would do when the thaw came. They both knew the pass would open again. The snow would shrink back. The rivers would churn and roar, and the world would move on. But what of them? What were they now, forged as they were in a crucible of cold and silence? One morning she found him carving something behind the cabin. She didn't interrupt, just stood by the door, watching as his knife worked a small piece of pine. When he finally looked up, he handed it to her wordlessly. It was a sparrow, rough and small, wings half folded. She turned it over in her palm, touched the grooves. Why this? He shrugged. They stay through winter. That night she placed it on the shelf above the hearth, beside a cracked tin cup and a twist of dried sage. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. But her chest ached with it. Days turned longer. A rabbit snared in the woods came with signs of shedding. The mules grew restless, hooves pawing the dirt with impatience. Mercy boiled their last beans with slivers of dried onion and felt the weight of time settling like dust. Elias spoke less. She caught him staring at the map sometimes, the one pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. His finger would trace the mountain ridge eastward, lips pressed into a line. One afternoon, Mercy followed him up the ridge behind the cabin. The snow was soft beneath their boots, the trees whispering overhead. At the top, he stopped and pointed. Flathead Valley, he said. Timber contracts, rail talk starting up, work if a man wants it. She looked down at the sweeping basin, white and wide and far away. You going? She asked. His silence answered her before his words did. I don't know. They stood a while, shoulders nearly touching, breath clouding the cold air. A bird called out somewhere below, sharp and sudden. A woodpecker, perhaps. You made it sound like there's work, she said, not like there's a place. He didn't meet her gaze. I've been looking for a place a long time, doesn't mean I've found one. When they walked back to the cabin, her hands felt colder than they should have. That evening, Elias brought in the map and laid it flat on the table. He ran his finger east again. I figure a week to reach the next town, if the thaw holds. Mercy stirred the coals, watched the sparks rise and die. You want me to go with you? His eyes found hers then, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then I want you warm, fed, safe. That's not an answer. He set his hands on the table, knuckles scarred, fingers worn. I want you with me, but I can't ask you to want that too. The wind moaned outside, soft and mournful. She crossed to him then, slow, as if approaching a wounded thing. She laid her palm over his heart, felt its steady beat. Then don't ask, she whispered, just stay. His arms came around her like shelter, like promise. That night they slept without walls between them. In the morning, the first patch of bare earth showed beneath the pines. Neither of them mentioned it. March brought thaw in earnest. The world shifted beneath them, snowbanks collapsing with dull thuds, streams awakening with murmur and rush. The cabin, once sealed tight by frost, began to breathe again. Wind crept through the chinks in the wall. The floorboards grew damp. The scent of rot and melt filled the air, rich with decay and promise. Mercy woke to birdsong one morning, the kind that hadn't touched the pines since November. She lay still beneath the quilt, listening. Beside her, Elias stirred, the heat of him familiar now, not startling but steady. He opened one eye, blinking against the dim. They're back. They never left, she said. We just couldn't hear them. Later that day the trail turned to mud. Wagon wheels buried to the spokes. The mules, shaggy and lean, woofed and stamped. Elias worked to free them, hands raw, boots sunk deep in the mire. Mercy helped where she could, though every step felt like dragging her past behind her. By evening, they had made it less than a mile. Elias leaned against a stump, wiping sweat from his brow. We'll have to wait, ground's not ready yet. She nodded, brushing mud from her skirt, not just the ground. They made camp there in the clearing, no more than a fire and a canvas stretched over a limb. The sky opened above them, wide and startling blue. Mercy watched a hawk wheel high overhead and felt the vastness of the world press down on her shoulders. She wasn't afraid of the road, but she was afraid of what might lie at its end. That night she sat beside Elias by the fire. He had taken to carving again, another scrap of pine in his lap. This one was slower coming. His hands worked with care, not urgency. "You ever want more than this?" she asked, eyes on the flames. He didn't look up. "I used to think wanting was a waste. And now." He set the carving down, half finished. It looked like an open hand, palm up. "Now I think it's the only thing that makes a man stay." Mercy turned his words over in her mind, slow as honey. She thought of all the places she'd tried to belong, the people she'd followed, the faces that had faded behind her. She thought of the cold months, the silence, the warmth they'd kindled between them without ever speaking its name. She reached out and touched the carved hand. "I want this," she said. "I want us." Elias' throat moved, but no words came. Instead, he took her hand in his, turned it over, and pressed something small and cool into her palm. The sparrow. She hadn't seen it since they'd packed the cabin. It was worn now, smoothed at the edges from being carried. "It flew with me," he said quietly. Mercy closed her fingers around it. They didn't leave the next day, or the one after. The trail stayed soft, and so did they. In the quiet hours, they made plans, not big ones, not promises scrawled in ink, but small agreements. A garden if they found good land, a stove with real iron burners, chickens maybe. "I'll build us a roof that don't leak," Elias said. "I'll keep your boots dry by the fire." Simple things, but spoken with weight. One morning, they met another soul on the trail, a man headed west with a wagon full of traps and a dog that limped. He eyed them with suspicion until Elias offered him coffee and Mercy wrapped the dog's paw in cloth. "You folks headed far?" the man asked. "Far enough," Elias said. The stranger nodded like he understood, though he said nothing more. That night Mercy watched the firelight flicker across Elias' face and thought how strange it was that survival had brought them together. But something deeper had kept them from parting. She had not chosen him out of desperation, not anymore. And he, she sensed, no longer saw her as a burden. They had been forged in winter, but the thaw had not undone them. It had only revealed what was already there, waiting beneath the ice. The road east was open by April, though still slick with melt and shadowed by the towering spine of the mountains. They left early, with the dawn light brushing the pines gold, the air thick with the scent of wet bark and thawing earth. Mercy rode beside Elias now, not behind. Their packs were lighter than before, but their silence was fuller, something shared, not endured. The mules moved slow, their winter weight shed but not forgotten. The cart groaned over ruts and rock, and the world, once hushed by snow, returned in fragments. Rushing streams, crows arguing in the branches, the creak of saddle leather beneath shifting hips. Mercy felt it all like a second heartbeat, wild and raw. They passed through ghost towns and ruined cabins. Snow still clung in shadows, but grass had begun to break through. In one place, a child's shoe lay in the mud, sun-bleached and half-buried. Mercy didn't ask, and Elias didn't stop. They moved on like the rivers, like everything that survives. In the third week, they came upon a small settlement, nothing more than 5 shacks and a lean chapel with no bell. Smoke rose from a stovepipe. Chickens scattered at the sound of hooves. A woman stepped out of the chapel, apron dusted with flour, eyes squinting against the sun. "Looking for something?" she asked. Elias touched the brim of his hat. "Work, land, if there's any going." She studied them both. Plenty of trees, no one to cut 'em. We got hungry bellies and no road worth a name. Mercy felt Elias glance at her. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. They stayed. That first night in the town, they slept on the chapel floor, the smell of old hymns and fresh bread thick in the air. Mercy lay beside Elias with her head on his shoulder, listening to the wind tug at the rafters. It was not the wild they had left behind, but it wasn't peace either. Not yet. In the mornings, Elias worked clearing brush and hauling timber. Mercy helped the women stitch clothes, gather water, scrape out sour pots. There was no pay, just food and a cot, and that was enough. They never told anyone they were married. There was no need. The others saw it in how they moved, how he kept her boots by the fire, how she mended his shirts without asking, in the way she leaned against him when the work was done, as if his stillness made her steadier. One evening, after the meal, the preacher asked if they'd like to have a ceremony. "Don't see the sense," Elias said, quiet but sure. "Already hers." Mercy didn't speak, just took his hand and laced her fingers with his, and the preacher nodded like that was blessing enough. Weeks turned, rain came, long and drenching, swelling the river and greening the hills. Mercy took to tending a small patch of soil behind the chapel, sprouting peas, sprigs of mint, wildflower seeds she'd bartered for with a skein of yarn. She knelt in the dirt with her hands buried, eyes half closed. Elias passed by once, paused at the gate. "You always this stubborn about coaxing things to grow?" he asked. Mercy sat back on her heels, fingers streaked with loam. "Only the ones worth waiting for." He smiled then, rare and unguarded. It broke something in her that she hadn't known was still braced. That night he gave her a small tin box. Inside were shavings of cedar, a handful of dried berries, and the tiny carved sparrow, its wing newly smoothed, its body warm from his pocket. "Thought maybe it could sit by the window," he said. "Watch the garden." She placed it on the sill the next morning. The sun caught on its beak just so, and for a moment it looked like it might take flight. They had weathered the cold together. Now came the harder part. Learning to live in warmth. Summer came slow to the valley, seeping in like honey. Days grew longer, the wind soft and fragrant with pine. The chapel bell, silent for years, rang out once on a June morning when a passing traveler brought word from the east, rail lines creeping closer, trade shifting, people moving like birds toward places with promise. But Mercy and Elias stayed. By then their cabin stood at the edge of the clearing, small, with a sloped roof and a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. Mercy had painted the door blue with pigments the preacher's wife helped her grind from wildflowers. Elias had built the hearth stone by stone, each one set with care. Smoke curled from it now like a ribbon, sweet with birch and pine. They lived quiet but not idle. Mercy's garden fed not only them but half the settlement, peas and squash, and little red potatoes that made the children grin with full mouths. She dried mint and wild rose for tea, her hands always working, always giving. Elias cut timber with the other men, but came home each evening without fail, hands blistered, shirt damp with sweat. He'd sit on the porch steps, boots unlaced, watching the light fade. Mercy would bring him water and sit beside him, their silence full and golden. No one asked where they'd come from. No one asked what had bound them. The truth lay plain in the way he rested his hand on her knee when storms rolled in the way she pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders when the night turned cold, even in summer. One morning she woke to find him gone from their bed. For a flicker of a moment, panic surged, old, deep-rooted. Then she heard the soft scrape of wood. She stepped outside barefoot, the earth still cool beneath her soles. Elias sat beneath the pine nearest the house, the same tree whose shadow had first darkened their roof. In his hands was another carving, larger this time, a tree, tall, branches sweeping wide. He didn't look up as she approached, thought I'd give it a proper shape. Mercy crouched beside him, brushing a curl of shavings from his knee. "It already had one," she said. "You just helped it remember." He set the carving aside, turned toward her. "You did that for me," he said. She didn't answer with words, just leaned in, pressed her lips to the hollow of his throat where his pulse beat steady. Not passion, not possession, just presence, just proof. That evening they sat by the fire, the air warm enough to leave the door open. Crickets sang. The stars blinked slowly into being, and somewhere in the woods, an owl called once, low and solemn. Elias took her hand and turned it over in his palm. "I used to think I was made for leaving," he said. Mercy's gaze was steady. "You stayed." He nodded, "Because you asked me to." She thought then of the woman she had been when winter found her, hollowed out, all edges, and of how he had never asked her to be softer, only held space for her to become it. They made love that night without urgency, like two people who had survived the cold and chosen, each morning, to keep surviving together. Months passed, the world outside shifted again, more folks came, more cabins rose, a teacher, a blacksmith, a midwife with silver hair and a laugh like wind chimes. Mercy and Elias grew into the land like roots, unseen but steady. Their love didn't blaze, it held. Through bad harvests, through lean winters, through nights when memories returned with teeth. They held each other through it all. And each spring, without fail, the sparrow watched from the windowsill. It never flew, but Mercy knew it didn't need to. It had already found home,